Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Today channel. Ridge decides to leave Ellie alone. He doesn't want to hurt anyone anymore. Taylor accuses Brooke and Eric of being responsible for Ridge's wedding bail. Taylor Hayes will hold Brooke Logan and Eric Forrester responsible for Ridge Forrester's decision to call off their wedding. She will sense that Luna's tendency to cause trouble could result in more serious issues at Lee's residence. The likelihood that Will Spencer will be the cause of Luna's demise increases with her level of obsession with him. Lee will try to stop this with another lecture, but so far, it hasn't worked. It is therefore not shocking that Lee's subsequent warning would also be disregarded. Lee will persuade Luna to understand that Will is off limits and will once again reject the idea that he is a realistic relationship prospect. Luna pursuing Bill Spencer's son and getting herself sent back to prison is the last thing Lee wants. Luna will continue to plot some fictitious favorable pregnancy findings, though, because she is determined to get Will. Because Luna was a veiled mystery woman that night, Lee won't understand that she's already gone too far with Will. On Monday's BMB episode, Thomas Forrester will become irate at Forrester Creations as he considers Brooke's grip on Ridge. Brooke will offer as good as she can and stress out that it was Taylor, not Ridge, who proposed. For Brooke, it will serve as evidence that Taylor is pushing the marriage idea. After complaining that Brooke had previously ruined Ridge and Taylor's happiness, Thomas will demand that it end right away. Thomas will defend his parents' love and their next new chapter together. Thomas won't have any updates on the awful news at the Forrester guest house, though, as Ridge recently acknowledged that he was unable to choose a wedding date or wed Taylor. Although Taylor will wonder why Ridge is applying the brakes, she might already be aware of the answer. This concerns Ridge's continued attraction to his Logan, particularly in the wake of Brooke's near-fatal incident in Italy. However, it will be simpler to accuse Brooke of controlling the circumstances, and Taylor won't mince words about Eric either. Eric will be accused by Taylor of manipulating Ridge's thoughts and forcing him to leave her. Even if it's not precisely the kind of love she had in mind, Ridge will make it plain that he will always love Taylor. Taylor will say she won't allow Ridge to do this because she will feel that this is her final opportunity at happiness. Taylor will appear quite pitiful as she makes a desperate appeal and tries to keep her engagement intact. Taylor's spin-out might not be able to postpone the inevitable for very long because Ridge and Brooke will eventually have a passionate reunion. Rana debuts, Thomas spirals. Ridge Forrester's statement. First up, we have Ridge, who is slated to wed Taylor Hayes. Ridge abruptly changed his mind when Taylor coerced him into setting a wedding date. Naturally, the fact that Ridge kept thinking about Eric Forrester's eerie remarks didn't help either. In any event, Ridge's choice will draw a lot of criticism. Brooke Logan had previously received a warning from confronted Thomas not to interfere with Taylor's romance. But Thomas will probably blame Brooke for everything when he finds out about his father's most recent choice. Although the blonde would really like Thomas to accept her, it is not going to happen at this time. Brooke will therefore be pleased to hear that Tridge is over, but it does not imply that she will be reunited. In the end, Rana gets assistance from Brooke and Katie Logan. The lady will be a socialite searching for the ideal dress. Naturally, given that Ridge is so popular in Monaco, Italy, and other nations, Rana will probably bring them up. Rana could perhaps be able to provide Brooke some guidance. Ridge's bones like the pervasive chill of the Pacific fog, a quiet, dreadful certainty that had been coalescing for months, perhaps years, finally settling its full weight upon him in the unnatural, orange-hued twilight of another Los Angeles sunset, viewed from the silence of his own sterile apartment. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, a man encased in glass, watching the endless stream of taillights bleed into one another on the 101, each one a tiny vessel carrying a person with hopes, secrets, and a terrifying fragility he now understood all too well, and he knew, with a finality that was both terrifying and peaceful, that he had to leave, that his very presence in this city, in the lives of those he had touched, was a slow-acting poison, and the most profound act of love he could now offer was a permanent and silent absence. This wasn't about running from consequences. He had weathered those storms, faced the anger, navigated the awkward reconciliations, and performed the delicate dance of atonement that never quite scrubbed the stain of past actions from the ledger of his relationships. No, this was something deeper, more fundamental, a recognition that the core of who he was, or perhaps who he had become in the crucible of this city's relentless ambition and sun-bleached artifice, was inherently corrosive, a flawed element that, no matter his intentions, inevitably created fractures in the people around him. He thought of her, of LA, not as a city but as a person, a woman of impossible light and profound shadow, and he saw with horrifying clarity the pattern of his touch upon her life, the initial, brilliant spark of connection that felt like destiny, followed by the inevitable, gradual tarnishing, the small compromises that grew into canyons of resentment, the slow dimming of her own light as she expended energy absorbing his chaos, smoothing his edges, and apologizing for the collateral damage he left in his wake. He had loved her, he truly had, with a ferocity that sometimes frightened him, but his love was a clumsy, heavy thing, like a beautiful sculpture made of lead, precious in intention but ultimately crushing to hold. He saw the faint worry lines that had etched themselves around her eyes, lines that hadn't been there before him, and he heard the subtle hesitation in her voice when she spoke of the future, a future she once painted with bold, confident strokes now sketched in cautious, tentative lines. He was the variable that introduced chaos into her equation, the crack in the foundation of her peace, and his greatest fear was not that she would forget him, but that she would remember him as the source of her pain, the architect of her cynicism. To stay, even with the most solemn vows of change, was a selfish gamble, a bet placed with her heart as the wager, and he could no longer stomach the odds. The city itself, with its relentless promise of reinvention, was a lie he could no longer tell himself. You could change your address, your job, your circle of friends, but you carried your own wreckage with you, and in a place as interconnected as LA, it was only a matter of time before his past and his nature collided with her present, creating another wave of hurt. He was a man who built castles in the sand just as the tide was coming in, and he was tired of watching them wash away, tired of asking others to help him rebuild on the same unstable shore. The love he felt was no longer a reason to stay. It was the very reason he had to go. It was the ultimate paradox. By holding on, he destroyed, only by letting go completely could he offer a chance for preservation. His departure would be his final, and only truly selfless, gift, the gift of peace, of quiet, of a life no longer punctuated by the drama he seemed to generate like a toxic atmosphere. He would become a ghost, a story she might tell someday with a wistful smile and a shrug, a lesson learned rather than a permanent wound. Packing was a surreal, minimalist exercise. He took only what he could carry, items that held no memory of her, of them, simple clothes, a few books whose words were his own, a passport filled with stamps from a life before. He left behind the artifacts of their shared history, the concert ticket stub, the faded sweater she always stole, the photograph from that weekend in Big Sur where they both looked impossibly young and happy, arranging them neatly on the kitchen counter, not as a plea for remembrance, but as a symbolic returning of what was always hers. He was not erasing himself, he was conceding the space, physical and emotional, that he had occupied. The drive out of the city, eastbound as the sun began to truly set, turning the smog into a spectacular, tragic palette of purples and reds, felt like crossing a border out of a country where he had been denied asylum. He didn't look back at the glittering skyline, that dazzling monument to ambition and illusion. He looked ahead, to the darkening, anonymous desert, a blank slate of emptiness that mirrored the void he hoped to create for her. He knew his absence would cause a different kind of pain, a sharp and sudden one, but he believed in its cleanliness. A clean break, a surgical incision, would heal better than a festering, chronic wound, which was all he believed he could offer by staying. He was choosing the pain of exile over the pain of infliction, and in that choice, he found a shred of the redemption he had always sought. He was, for the first time, prioritizing her healing over his own desire for forgiveness, her future peace over his present comfort. He was hurting himself to stop hurting her, and in that paradoxical equation, he found a terrible, profound peace. The highway stretched out before him, empty and straight, and as the last lights of the city vanished from his rearview mirror, swallowed by the night and the rising hills, he took a breath that felt like the first truly honest one in years. He was alone, but he was no longer a danger. He was free from the prison of his own destructive potential, and he had, in his final act, set everyone else free too. The road ahead was unknown, but it was quiet, and its silence was not a condemnation, but a promise. He had finally understood that sometimes, the strongest love is not a fierce, possessive flame, but a gentle, releasing breath, and he exhaled his goodbye into the dark, empty desert air, leaving nothing behind but the space for her to finally, and fully, breathe again. Taylor Hayes, its self-appointed judge and furious prosecutor, found her defendants in the stunned, guilty silence of Eric Forrester and the tear-streaked, bewildered devastation of Brooke Logan. To any other observer, Ridge's flight from his own wedding was the latest, most dramatic iteration of his eternal vacillation, a choice born from the chaotic whirlwind of his own heart. But for Taylor, a woman whose entire life had been a pendulum swing between profound love and profound loss, this was no spontaneous act of passion, it was a calculated, cruel execution, and Eric and Brooke were the architects who had loaded the gun and placed it in her son's hand, smiling all the while. Her accusation, leveled not in a scream but in a voice scraped raw by betrayal, was a meticulously constructed indictment that wove together decades of history, manipulation, and what she saw as the fundamental, soul-corrupting selfishness that defined the Forrester family's patriarch and the woman he inexplicably championed. She blamed Eric for his grandiose, patriarchal machismo, for orchestrating this entire farcical union not out of love for her or a desire for his son's happiness, but as a final, desperate power play to cement his own legacy and spite his son Steffi, for whom Ridge's choice of Taylor was a subtle rebellion against Eric's dominion. Eric, she argued, had painted this wedding as the closing of a circle, the restoration of his family to its rightful state, applying a pressure so immense and so public that it forced Ridge into a corner from which the only escape was a catastrophic, last-minute betrayal. He had created a gilded cage, and Ridge, feeling the bars close in, had simply flown away, leaving her to be the one left behind in the lockup. And then there was Brooke. Always Brooke. Taylor's wrath towards her was of a different, more acidic variety, less about political maneuvering and more about a perceived spiritual poison. She blamed Brooke not for anything she had done that day, but for everything she had ever been. She blamed her for the very essence of her being, for her relentless, tragically flawed romanticism that men mistook for passion, for her inability to ever truly let go, for the countless times she had whispered "I love you" to Ridge across a crowded room or through the phone lines, each utterance a tiny crack in the foundation Taylor was trying to build. Brooke's mere existence in Los Angeles was, in Taylor's scorched earth view, an open invitation, a perpetual backup plan that Ridge knew he could always fall back on. She had spent weeks, months, playing the supportive best friend, the self-sacrificing martyr, her tears a constant, manipulative drizzle on their happiness, ensuring Ridge's guilt and sympathy were forever engaged. Brooke, Taylor seethed, had never truly accepted the relationship. She had merely bided her time, weaponizing her vulnerability, her history, her destiny with Ridge, until the weight of it all became too much for him to bear. She was the siren's call from the shore, and Eric had been the one to shove Ridge out to sea directly into her path. Together, they formed a perfect pincer movement of emotional warfare, Eric with his blunt force expectations, and Brooke with her insidious, soulful longing. In the raw aftermath, Taylor's mind became a relentless editor, replaying every recent interaction with a new, sinister audio track. Eric's enthusiastic toast at the rehearsal dinner now sounded not like a blessing, but a demand. Brooke's heartfelt, trembling well wishes the night before were not a concession but a warning shot. The way Ridge had grown quieter, more pensive, under the combined weight of his father's triumphant glee and his ex-wife's mournful eyes, it wasn't pre-wedding jitters, it was the quiet dread of a man walking a plank built by the two people he trusted too much. Taylor hadn't just been left at the altar, she had been the unwitting pawn in a game she hadn't known they were playing. Her love, her trust, her hard-won stability after so many breakdowns, had been the betting chips on a table where Eric wagered for control and Brooke wagered for a love she felt entitled to. Ridge's ultimate decision was, in her scorched earth rationale, not a choice at all but a reaction, the inevitable outcome of their relentless pressure. He hadn't chosen Brooke over her, he had chosen freedom from them. But that freedom came at the cost of her public humiliation, and for that, she would never forgive them. This was not the familiar heartache of losing Ridge to Brooke in a fair fight, this was something far more violating. It was the realization that the victory she thought she had achieved, Ridge's ring on her finger, Eric's blessing on her head, Brooke's seeming acceptance, was a mirage constructed by them to lure her into the open, where she could be ambushed and destroyed. Their blame was absolute because their actions had not merely influenced an outcome, they had designed the trap, and Taylor, in her beautiful wedding gown, had been the bait. The betrayal was so complete, so orchestrated, that it eclipsed even her anger at Ridge himself, for he was, in this moment, just another of their victims, another son manipulated by his father and seduced by a fantasy. But she was the casualty, and Eric and Brooke were the enemy commanders who had orchestrated her defeat from the comfort of their own self-righteousness, leaving her alone in the ruins of a wedding that was never meant to be, a ceremony that was, from its very conception, a beautifully wrapped lie destined to be torn apart by the very hands that had tied the bow. Thomas Forrester with the force of a physical blow, not for the dissolution of the union itself, his parents' on-again, off-again romance was as reliable and cyclical as the tides, a foundational instability he had built his entire life upon, but for the seismic, world-altering opportunity it represented, an opportunity that was now being casually, cruelly, and incomprehensibly dismissed by the one person he had begun to believe was his sole remaining ally. He had learned of Ridge and Taylor's latest, and perhaps final, fracture not from a weeping mother or a brooding father but from a pair of interns whispering over swatches of silk, their voices a hushed, excited buzz that spoke of drama rather than heartbreak, and in that moment, his entire world telescoped down to a single, shining point of possibility, Hope. Hope, who was now free, her marriage to his father a thread finally severed by his mother's return, a return that had now, miraculously, evaporated. Hope, the luminous, maddening, unobtainable object of his every desire, the woman for whom he had fought, schemed, and rebuilt himself, was no longer his father's wife. The forbidden wall that had made her eternally untouchable had crumbled to dust without him having to lift a finger, and the path, that long, tortuous path he had been forced to walk alone, was now suddenly, gloriously clear. This was the moment, the cosmic realignment he had been waiting for, the justification for every twisted choice and every moment of anguish. It was all worth it because destiny, in its infinite wisdom, was finally handing him his prize, and the electric, all-consuming certainty of this truth propelled him through the halls of Forrester Creations with a singular purpose, a man possessed by a glorious, terrifying fixity of mission, needing only to share this epiphany with the one man who would understand, the one man who had seen his struggle and had recently offered a hand in solidarity, his grandfather, Eric. He found the patriarch not in his sun-drenched office, a place of business and legacy, but in the sanctum of the design room, a space that smelled of charcoal, ambition, and memory, and Eric looked up from a sketch with a warm, grandfatherly smile that immediately curdled at the edges when he saw the frantic, feverish light in his grandson's eyes. "Thomas? What is it? What's happened?" he asked, his voice a gentle rumble of concern, and Thomas, breathless, his words tumbling over each other in his urgency, announced the news not as a tragedy but as a triumph, a coronation, the long-awaited answer to a prayer. "Grandfather, it's Mom and Dad. It's over. They broke up. For good this time. Don't you see what this means?" he implored, his voice cracking with the sheer weight of the revelation. "It means there's nothing standing in my way. Nothing. Hope is free. My father has no claim on her anymore. The one thing everyone said was impossible, the one obstacle everyone used to tell me to move on, it's gone. This is it. This is my chance. My real chance." He expected a shared joy, a wise nod of agreement, perhaps even a blessing. He expected Eric to see the beautiful, logical symmetry of it all, the son finally claiming the woman the father had foolishly let slip away. He expected the man who had recently praised his transformation, who had stood by him when others had turned their backs, to see this not as an obsession but as destiny finally clicking into place. But Eric's face did not light up with understanding. Instead, it fell, the lines of age and experience deepening into grooves of profound disappointment and dawning alarm. He saw not a man liberated by opportunity but a man enslaved by a delusion, and the love he felt for his grandson warred with a crushing sense of déjà vu. He saw the same frantic energy, the same possessive glint, the same terrifying single-mindedness that had led Thomas to manipulate, to lie, to build a fake pregnancy, to steal a child. This was not growth, this was the same old sickness wearing the faint, flimsy mask of recovery, triggered anew by the slightest shift in the wind. Thomas, no, Eric said, his voice soft but firm, heavy with an immense and weary sadness. That's not what this means. That's not what this means at all. He stepped closer, his hands gesturing not in excitement but in placation, as if trying to calm a spooked animal. This has nothing to do with you and Hope. This is about your mother and father and their inability to make a life together. It's their tragedy, not your opportunity. You cannot look at their pain and see it as your opening.